Hi everybody, I hope that you're doing well. Welcome to Beekeeping 101, Class 3. For anyone who might be curious what we're covering in this little short span of a meeting, we will be talking about the seasons that you're going to go through with your hive, what you're looking for in your hive, what as a beekeeper perhaps you should be keeping an eye on in each coming season. We'll handle spring, which is one of our most active seasons, summer, and then we are going to have an interlude in between fall and summer talking about pest management because it relates strongly to the spring, summer, and fall season. So I kind of put it in the middle of those. And then we'll go on to have fall and winter, of course, which is by far our shortest one. But to continue on with our Beekeeping 101, if you're in your hives right now, this is probably something that you're seeing. Hopefully they're collecting a lot of honey. I'd like to see some frames with pollen, but your brood is overall a good pattern, but still a little bit smaller. Enough for the present moment. Now we'll move on to spring, hopefully. All right, spring, one of the busiest seasons of the year for a beekeeper. This is when bees begin ramping up. And spring starts early, so February, even sometimes January, but most of the time February and March are peak times to be getting ready for your spring season. You want to be hopefully seeing your bees out, here in Texas anyway, because it stays pretty warm. Here in Texas, you want to be seeing your bees out, and you want to be looking inside your hive, weather permitting. The weather can be a little bit finicky that time of year, but it normally in Texas is plenty warm to be getting inside of your hives, at least here in the Dallas area. If you're coming from beyond that, then you'll have to gauge it according to what you've got in your seasons. All right, you should be seeing a good brood pattern. Come spring, the disposition of the bee is to ramp up production. Even if they don't quite have the food to support it, they're going to start encouraging the queen to lay as many eggs as possible. You want that nice football shape. If you're not seeing that, sometimes it just means that you have to boost them with food, but you are starting to raise bees for the honey flow. Like, this is when it starts. You need all of those bees you can possibly get. Hopefully, in the fall, you will have ordered your queens, so you'll begin receiving your queens. On average, they have a date that you would normally say, I'm going to sign up for March the 4th, and I'm going to get queens on that day. And you sign up in the fall. If you're signing up in January or around Christmas, you're really cutting it fine. They may not have anything available. Queens don't just show up on demand. You have to have the correct weather. You have to have the drone production ready and waiting in order to have the appropriate number of queens. So if you have queens that you have ordered, make sure that they come in, and if they get delayed, don't freak out, don't get worried. Not only that, but if you'll notice the post office box right behind the hand, if you're receiving them in the mail, go beforehand, like maybe a week or two before the time you're expecting your queens. Go to your post office, give them your number, say, I am expecting bees on this date to this address. Please call me, do not drop them off. I will come and pick them up. And they will. Usually about 7 in the morning, they will call you. And they will say, your bees are here, come and get them. Because they really don't like live insects. But you don't want them placed in your mailbox to freeze or get hot or get wet or delivered to your house when nobody's home. So it's much better for you to pick them up and to be able to control that process as much as you can, because I have seen queens arrive in boxes, all of them dead for some reason, and it's normally because they got too hot, too cold, or too wet inside of shipping. So be mindful of that as a good steward of your queens. Plus, you've spent a lot of money. You really want them to come in looking good. You do want to keep an eye out for SUPERSEDURE cells. If you have queens that perhaps need to be replaced, you might start seeing a spotty brood pattern. This is a very good example of what a spotty brood pattern will. You can see it's also called a shotgun brood pattern, and you can see that they're just scattered all over the frame. Not only that, but you'll notice on the top and in the middle bottom of the frame, you'll see queen cells. Most of them look as if they've hatched out or are just getting started, one or the other. And that is what you're looking for when you're looking for supersedure cells. Swarm cells, you'll usually see an abundance of good brood, lots of bees, and they'll most often be on the lower half of the frame rather than the middle and top. If they're on the lower half of the frame and you have swarm cells, you have to take measures for that, but we'll address that just a little later on in the top. If you have supersedure cells, you have just a few options. You can, as a beekeeper, allow them to requeen themselves. You will wait around a month before you get working bees again from that queen. And your hive will become very depleted. Bees do it all the time in nature. You can let them requeen themselves, but if they get a cold snap, or if it's raining all the time, or if a bug eats them or a bird eats them because they're hungry, you may have to reintroduce a queen to that hive. Or if you have a queen on hand, like a little extra nook box, or maybe a weak hive, but the queen is still doing well, you can join them together. Or you can add your queen in just on her own. But you want to keep an eye out for this. This can happen any time of the year, but in spring, if you're not keeping an eye on it, you won't get any honey flow for sure. Still, there's no guarantees. Swarming, as mentioned. Swarming is also very common in spring. This is when you get the biggest, most beautiful swarms. They usually start showing up March, May. That's some of the height of swarming season, but they certainly go into the summer months too. If you are wanting to collect swarms or to prevent swarms, those are two different things. So if you're wanting to prevent swarms, you want to make sure your bees have enough space, that they have room to grow, and that's about it. They will usually not swarm. The hive that you see on the right is a prime example of what it looks like when your hive perhaps is a little too full and is ready to swarm. You don't usually see this very early in the year, but keep an eye out for those queen cells, because the queen cells at the bottom and a really packed hive accompanied with a good brood pattern means that your hive is probably trying to swarm. And once that happens, if you want to stop it, you have to catch it early. You have to catch it while the queen cells are usually very little. They haven't drawn them out very much. There's not a big larva in there, and they most certainly shouldn't have capped them. If you have gotten to the stages where they've drawn them out, there's a full-size larva just about to be capped over in there, that's a queen, and or they have capped over the cells, you usually can't stop them from swarming. You can put a queen excluder on the bottom to try to prevent them from going. You can give them more space, but they're kind of like a stubborn teenager that's made up their mind to move out, and regardless of the smart idea it may or may not be, they are moving out. At that point, you do damage control. You try to track where they've dropped off and maybe capture the swarm. Or you just allow them to do what they're going to do, split, swarm, and you start over from the top. The reason most beekeepers don't want to do this is they lose half of their hive and therefore most often half of their honey yield. It also means that you're putting a lot of bees out in the environment. If you're in a town setting, you probably want to prevent swarming as much as possible in order to have a courtesy for your neighbors and your whole neighborhood for that matter, because those bees most often don't go to another hive, they go into somebody's house. And you do not want to be the person who's called when you have to pull them out of a house, because they are hard to get out and usually require a great deal of construction. So if you're in town, prevent swarming. If you're in the country, that is up to you, but I still wouldn't recommend it because you still usually have neighbors, even in the country. If you want to capture swarms, that's oftentimes easier. As beekeepers, we get calls all the time where someone's like, there are bees at my house, they're as big as, a child's car, and come and get them. They're really close to the ground, you can get them really easily. Don't fall for that. We have iPhones nowadays. If someone says that, make sure that you say, send me a picture of where the bees are and what they look like. Those bees oftentimes are just settling there for a temporary moment. you have to go quickly to get them. Unless there's poor weather, they'll generally move on within the day or less, within hours sometimes. And you have that short amount of time to get them while they're capable. Now, if that person sends you a picture of the huge swarm that's landed really close to the ground, and instead of being very close to the ground, they're about 30 feet in the air and they're the size of a baseball, that happens quite a bit too. So always be cautious. Also, you should charge for your services. It's expensive to run gas back and forth, and it is hard to get swarms to stay inside a hive. You may have put them in the lap of luxury with comb and brood, but they don't always want to stay. But if you want to try, you get your box ready, you bring it there, sealed up on the bottom, and if you have it, you would put a frame of brood in and maybe a frame of honey, because they're tempted by the brood. They really like it. And then a couple of frames. Leave some space for the bees to be dropped in on. And then you go up to this tree limb. This looks like a vitex tree here, very close to the ground. You put your box right under that big swarm, and you grab the tree limb and give it a sharp shake, close it up, and walk away. You are going to have, and tell the people who you just got the swarm from, you are going to have recongregation of the bees there more often than not, probably for a couple of days, because they're sitting there puzzled going, where did our queen go? Where did our bees go? But more often than not, they will disperse without issue. Swarms are also fairly mild-mannered because before they swarm, they load up on honey. All those bees are stuffed to the gills with food and just looking for a new home. They don't want an argument with anyone on average. Even a very aggressive swarm will be, or a very aggressive hive that swarms will usually be a gentle swarm. So beware of that whenever you're capturing swarms. You can get very different temperaments once they develop into a full-sized hive. Other ways that you would requeen, split, you name it, in the springtime, more often than not. The number one way, probably here in Texas, is a nuke. A nuke hive is the one you see on the left, and it is just a tiny hive with about 5 frames in it, and it's got a queen that's laying along with full-size bees. The real benefit of this is the ease of picking it up, getting it into your full-sized hive where you need it, and then having just the blessing of knowing that that queen is a laying queen. You can see the brood for yourself. You know that they already have a jump start on life. So they're by far the most popular to use a nuke. You can see the queen cells, so you can allow them to requeen themselves, or even make a little split off your own hive and require them to raise their own queen in a small nucleus hive. You can do that for yourself. It's called a hive and a half. So you would have your normal hive, and then if you say wanted to make a little split, but not a full-size split, in order to raise a queen and begin raising that to another hive, you'd get yourself a nuke box. You'd have extra frames on the side to refill in that space, and you'd make sure that you do not get the queen. And you take your bees out and put them in your nuke box, and preferably take them far enough away that they're not going to come back, more than 2 miles. And you leave them there, feeding them and caring for them for 2 weeks, and you can bring them back to your hive or your bee yard and put them in a hive of your choice that you preferably have built for them, and they're ready to go. They're going to start growing into a full-sized hive. But it takes them a while to recover from being queenless. So I told you a month before they raise their young bees. Well, that month is multiplied by the amount of time it takes them to fill up that little nuke box before you actually put it into a full-sized hive. So that is probably closer to 2 months in order for them to raise their own queen and get large enough to need a full-sized hive, or be able to protect it for that matter. Most of the time that's done early, like say March is one of the more common seasons for doing little nuke splits like that, because most of the time there are drones in the area at that point, so you can reliably guess that she's going to be mated appropriately. When you start getting later in the year, you stop seeing that so much. Packaged bees. Packaged bees are still sold. They are not commonly sold here in Texas, as their popularity has gone downhill with sort of the rise of nucleus hives in that. But you can still purchase them. They'll have a queen on the inside, usually sealed up in some sort of can feature. And then you have your your cluster of bees around her. They're all humming around her, trying to see what's going on, taking care of her. And all you do with that packaged bees is you have your hive ready, like you would do with your little nucleus hive, except there's no previous comb or brood on it. So you open up that hive, you would preferably bring a frame of brood in from your other hive. You stick your queen on there, allow them to release her, and then you just flip over the package and dump your bees right into that hive, close up the lid. Hopefully you have food ready for them in the hive, and then you walk away, come back a week later to make sure she's released. So it's a very simple process, but they have to start fresh when it comes to comb and when it comes to brood rearing, because they essentially have nothing to start with. Spring building. So spring's eventful for those bees, as previously mentioned. This is a wonderful picture of what's called festooning. And festooning is when the bees cling together in long chains. And as a beekeeper, you probably will have gotten in your hive, pulled apart 2 frames, and you're like, why are all these bees clinging together? And that's just festooning. They're making wax. They literally hang in long chains, and they do a little quiver. And their abdomen has glands in it that produce a wax secretion, and it hardens when it hits the air. It's pure white. And then they shape that into honeycomb as we know it. Now, a big fight for beekeepers who are using Langstroth style combs or top bar style hives, you have to have the bees pull wax. That takes a ton of resources. They prefer to do this in the spring. They will usually ramp up production around March through June, late June. And after that, they just dive off a cliff. They don't want to build wax at that time. They have hit the dearth. They don't really have an interest in it. You might get them to build a little wax in the fall, but very rarely. Most of the time, your prime wax building time of year is in the spring. That's when you put in all your extra equipment and try to get them ready. All right, summer. Summer is awesome. We're in summer right now. So their nectar sources have changed. In spring, they have tons of nectar. There's usually water in the system, and your trees will produce pollen that they will use. Your black-eyed Susans, your meadow pinks, all sorts of plants are out at that time. Summer, the field gets a little narrower. They start working things like sunflowers, echinacea. This is a picture of society garlic. They love garlic plant. It's blooming right now. I have some at my house right now. And they'll start working these sources very heavily, like they won't ever leave it alone. You also have different types of sources that live inside of wooded areas that get a little more shade, maybe hold a little more water because they're in lower spaces, like Virginia creeper. Yes, poison ivy. They will work poison ivy, especially in the dry years, because it tends to produce pollen and nectar even in the dry years. And to answer your question, no, it usually doesn't mean that you're going to have a breakout. I'm allergic to poison ivy, and I know I have it in my honey. I've never had any issue from eating it. It's not a problem. It's just one of those interesting things that they'll collect from the less desirable plants like cactus or buttonweed, things that grow in the undergrowth, especially Virginia creeper, as previously mentioned, and a couple of others that I can't even get into how many there are. Provide water for your thirsty bees. This time of year, they are thirsty. They are looking for anything. We have not had rain in forever, it feels like. We had a lot of lightning, but no rain. Provide water. They love bird baths. Whenever you provide water, provide it not too far from your hives, and allow them places where they can cling on to it so they don't fall in and drown. They don't usually prefer perfectly clean and pristine water. They like it a little bit grimy on average. So like if you have a drip under a hose, you can put a water dish there with some stones in it or some burlap in it so that they're not going to fall in and drown. And they tend to prefer that. I myself have a crummy little black bowl that has been roughed up on the sides because someone gave it to us and their horse had chewed on it. And they love it. It gets slime in it every year, and this is their preferred watering hole. Go figure. Also, crack your hives. You want to be mindful of robbing. I'll get into that just a little bit. But you will often, if you have a spring bottom board, you'll slide out any covers you have In Texas, usually starting in the spring, you'll remove those covers, because if it's hot the whole season, like if you're getting into the 80s, even at night, you definitely want that screen bottom board off. You can even do it a little earlier than that. I know plenty of beekeepers who have screen bottom boards and don't ever really close them, except in the very coldest months, like December, January, and they usually take it off after January. Like, that's it. They're not messing with it anymore. So the bees are very good at keeping their hive cool. One of the only insects that actually temperature controls inside their hive. It's extraordinary how they do that. They literally have a system of bees that pump cool air into the hive and hot air back out of the hive. You can also crack your lid. So what that looks like is, if you have an inner cover and a telescoping lid, you might just put something the size of a popsicle stick, something very small, between that telescoping outer cover and the inner cover in order to prop it up so that the bees have another entrance from which to fan air into the hive. So it is a desirable thing. If you are experiencing robbing, though, you can't do that. You've got to close up your top. You have to reduce your entrance. Robbing is not always a problem. I have 30 hives. I've only seen robbing once in 13, 15 years worth of keeping bees. So it's not as common as people think. However, I have seen it happen. It does happen. One of the prevention ways is how you feed. You want to not use an outdoor feeder. You want to have an in-hive feeder that other bees cannot get to. And we'll cover more of those options later. You also can reduce the entrance or put branches in front of the entrances. Don't worry, most of the time you will know if it is robbing. You will look at your hive and there will be like 5 sets of bees fighting it out with each other, and tons of bees in the front trying to get in that aren't being let in. And that is what robbing usually looks like. But ask someone before you freak out. It's not always robbing. Sometimes they're just really busy if they found a source. But if you start seeing a bunch of bees fighting on that entrance, you should close it down, put branches in front of it, make sure your lid is not cracked, make sure there's not sugar water on the outside. If you have a persistent problem that continues to happen in that same place year after year after year, you need to consider moving your hives, because something about the location makes it extra tempting. Speaking of feeders, there are a lot of different ways to feed. It's time to feed, like right now, this time of year. I talked about how their nectar sources change. There's not nearly as many as there were in the spring. And as stewards of our bees, we want to make sure that they have the food that they need. And one of that is sugar water. This time of year, they don't seem to come by it. There seems to be more pollen available, but not nearly as much nectar. And part of that's because plants really don't produce a lot of nectar when there's not a lot of water. They need a good balance of the two, dry and wet, in order to produce that prime nectar flow that you see during the honey flow. You can have an in-hive feeder. See the middle black feeder right in the middle of the frame of, not the frame, I guess the frame of the PowerPoint. That is called an in-hive feeder. It replaces 1 to 2 frames of your actual bee frames inside your hive. If you have robbing issues, this might be a very good option. If you don't have to do this. It is something that you have to be geared up in order to get into, because you do have to crack that hive to open it up in order to pour your sugar water in. But it's very effective. The top piece that you see on that black thing is called a cap and ladder. It just allows the bees to climb into it with less dead bees put into it. One of the bad sides about this is that if you have too much sugar water in there, it can ferment. And or if your hive is weak or just is a dirty hive, they sometimes like to throw dead bodies in there, and you can't really effectively feed them that way. I have hives that do both. A Boardman feeder, which is in the upper right corner, you can see it sticking off of the front of the hive. That is one of the most popular, especially for a beginning beekeeper, because you can see the bees drink it down. as an experienced beekeeper, I still use these to gauge the strength of a hive, because a strong hive can suck that thing down in hours. A weak hive will usually leave it a couple of days or more, and that tells me something about the hive without ever having to go in it. So it's very beneficial if I'm observing the strength of a hive, what might be going on. Top feeder, which is below the Boardman feeder on the lower right-hand corner. You can see that it is a wooden box, like your other wooden boxes. You would treat and stain this. It sits on top of your hives. Your bees can or can't. There are a lot of different models. Let me just say that. This is only one of undoubtedly hundreds of models. Some allow your bees to get in directly onto the syrup. The one that is pictured here has a wire mesh right over the middle of it, which is where the bees crawl up, and the bees can't directly go floating in the syrup. They have to climb down, and they can easily climb up and out if they are behind that screen mesh. Others allow their bees to freely come up, and then they begin to, they might have a flotation device or dozens of other methods that allow the bees to get into the syrup. Long and short of it is, if you're going to use a top feeder, that is up to preference. There are so many styles. You don't necessarily, you should, but I have known people to pop the top cover and be able to get in to feed their bees without having to be fully geared up, maybe just some Vail and gloves, because the bees will come out of the front entrance, but depending on what variety of feeder you have, they can't necessarily come up at you from the top of the box. Now this goes directly on top of whatever your top box is that is holding bees, and then you put your inner cover and your telescoping lid over it. The only admonition is A, not unlike the in-hive feeder, if it is put in a hive that is not strong enough to eat it all within a couple of weeks, especially in this heat, it will often go bad, and you have to dump it out and start again. So it can be wasted, but at the same time, you don't have to get in them as much. This one that I'm looking at holds about 2 gallons, 1 gallon each side. So there's a lot less work that you have to put into feeding them on a daily basis. So might really appeal for some of you, especially if your hives are off property. Last but not least, and mind you, there are a million other ways to feed your bees. These are just some of the more popular options. Last but not least, open feeding. And you can see the dog water on the side. They probably have some burlap or some stones in there so the bees aren't drowning. But they've literally taken the dog water, filled it up with sugar water, and put it out for their bees. And the bees will come and eat from it. Never any issue. All of your hives will get some if they're strong enough to get bees out to that point. And the only downside is that you're not just feeding your bees, you're feeding the whole neighborhood's bees. So you can expect to expend more sugar water very quickly. But at the same time, it's not so much trouble. You can change it out at night when the bees are away from it, and you can put a larger quantity out at any given time, which is really beneficial. But you want to feed your bees in order to build up for the fall and the winter. This time of year is the time when bees starve in Texas, anywhere after the honey flow. Oops, wrong way. Speaking of honey flow, this year's honey flow was a little later for me, so I did it right at the beginning of August where I pulled my honey. But as a beekeeper, you can do it anywhere from usually late spring to early summer is the most common time period to pull your honey, because bees, on average, only make a surplus of honey in the very first part of the year. In the spring and summertime. That's when there's enough nectar available that they're packing it in for later. That's why we feed at other times, to compensate for the honey that we've just stolen from them. But it's a lot of fun. Now, if you were in our previous class, you got the opportunity to hear some of the different varieties of honey and how to extract it. So I won't get into that in depth. Suffice it to say, once you pull your honey, you should be thinking about feeding and treating your bees. Speaking of treatment, we're coming into the pest management section. Okay, so we've covered spring, we've covered summer, pest management is next. And pest management is a big topic in beekeeping without fail. Make sure, once you've pulled your supers, to put your wax moth crystals into stored supers if you're not planning to put them back on your bees or not having them in use. A little care will save you a lot of money in the end. I cannot tell you how many beekeepers I've had who have had to purchase equipment over and over and over again because they didn't keep an eye on their wax moth crystals. Now, they don't come in a little tube like that, but where you would purchase them is actually the laundry section in any Walmart on average. And they come in a little baggie now. It's kind of about this big. It's still got the blue theme. It says moth crystals. Do not get mothballs. They are not the same thing. Moth crystals are what you want, or you can also purchase from a bee store, and there's a couple of other brands like Paramoth. If you call anyone and ask any bee store and ask what you need in order to keep the wax moths out of your supers, they can usually tell you without any trouble, or you can purchase it from yourself. Remember, wax moth crystals. One of the reasons this is such a big deal is not just because of the webbing that you see in the upper left corner, but it is because of the bees. The bees can't always take care of all the comb they've built. That's some of the beauty of a Langstroth hive, is you can reuse the comb from year to year. But if you allow it to get infested with wax moths, which can happen at any time in the year, you will have to often replace the woodenware, not just the foundation. If you ever get as bad as the picture you see here, first thing you're gonna do is you're gonna pop out that comb and you're gonna throw it away. You can't do anything with that plasticell foundation covered in wax moth larvae. If it's gotten this bad, there's also probably some damage on your woodenware because the cocoon that they spin partially goes into the actual wood and creates little dimples inside of it. It's easy to spot. If you've ever seen it once, you'll never forget it. But they're just little dimples. And after a while, if that's a really bad infestation, it can most certainly weaken your wood. And you'll have to purchase a whole new box if you don't take care of what you have. Oop, keep going the wrong way. Pest management. Okay, wax moths, to go back just a little bit, wax moths are one of the only things you really can't treat inside the hive. You don't do anything. You can only treat it when your supers are off. The number one thing they say about wax moths is that the best defense against wax moths is a strong hive. If they're in your hive, you can downsize your equipment, pull it off, try to put it in wax moth crystals, freeze it first if you possibly can. That's the best way to kill any eggs in there. But if you have wax moths inside your hive, there's usually a systemic problem. They're what's called a symptomatic pest. Remember that, because there are real pests that will kill your hive, and then there are symptomatic pests that are just bothersome to your hive, and if your hive is strong, there's not an issue with them. Wax moths is one of them. The other one is hive beetles. Hive beetles, the cute little beetle you see in the right side. Hive beetles are very common. It's easy to see them. You open up your hive, you're like, oh, there are beetles in my hive. Oh no. And they're usually on the top board because the bees can't kill them in a hive necessarily. Their shell is too hard for the bee to sting. They don't heat up enough to where a bee can cluster them and kill them. And so what do the bees do? They build them little prisons and feed them. Like, they don't even starve them to death. They build them little propolis prisons on the top bar. And those little beetles will run around in there until a beekeeper happens to come along, pop off that top lid, and then they're like, woo, free! And they escape. I usually smash them a little bit because I don't like them. They are not usually a problem. If you're seeing like 1 or 2, even up to 5, it's not usually an issue. If you start seeing more than that, like seeing 12 that run off your top board every time, you should start being concerned and keeping an eye on what's going on inside your hive. Again, a symptomatic pest. It usually means that you're going queenless, your hive's getting weak for some reason, that they can't defend against these beetles. The beetle actually doesn't have a full life cycle inside the hive. They will roam around the hive, eating honey, eating pollen, hitching rides around, but they don't really do a lot. But their larvae can. They lay eggs near the honey because they are originally a fruit beetle. They love, 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 love sweet treats. That's why they go for the honey. And you can see a picture of what the larva looks like when it has severely damaged comb. what you see, they talk about your honey being shiny, and in this picture you can see it very well. What they do is they basically poop all over your honey. Your bees don't want it, you don't want it. It is now feces covered honey, and you have to throw it away. And it is so heartbreaking to have to do that to stores that you thought your bees had. But if you're starting to see frames like this, you need to get rid of them. If you're having a constant problem with hive beetles, you also can do a couple of things to prevent that. Having them in more sunlight is important. If you don't have them in more sunlight, then you need to maybe find about half a day's worth of sunshine. They don't like it when it gets hot and dry. This time of year, they're starting to go down in levels, but we had a lot of humidity late into the summer, so hive beetles were very bad for a long time. But they don't kill your hive. Again, symptomatic pest. They are just a pest. They are not the problem. They are exhibiting whatever the issue is. That your hive is weak for some reason or another. But I said they don't finish their life cycle inside the hive, so they trot around in the hive, they lay their eggs, they eat the honey, and when they're ready to pupate after their little wormy cells have slimed your honey, they crawl right outside and drop onto the ground, burrow in, and become full beetles in the ground. Some ways of preventing this is by maybe having your bees on concrete, or perhaps having your having something out like a strong cloth or something undesirable to them. There's really not a treatment for them in hive except for beetle traps and beetle cloths, but they're not a treatment per se. They are chemical free, bonus. Beetle traps are a little trap that sits inside the top bar. You put a little oil in it. The beetles run away from the bees and they go, oh, look, a hidey hole, and they jump into it is the idea. Or it smells good and they climb into it if you use beetle oil with bait, and they die in the oil. That is the simplest way. You usually take them out, and when they're full, you either empty them, tapping them, or throw them away, which is really what they're meant to be done with. You can use any oil that's a food grade oil, but they are fruit beetles, so sometimes using a baited oil will attract them a little better. And they usually chop up banana peel and allow it to cook inside of the oil before they put it in, into those beetle traps. So it's more of an attractant for those beetles. There's beetle cloths. Beetle cloths, quite simply, are dryer sheets. That's the great trick. The laundry section, again, is a beekeeper's friend. So they are dryer sheets with no scent on them, preferably natural if you can get them. And you just take your little sheet and you put it either on the top or the bottom, but I prefer to put it on the top because that's where I often see the little beetles running around. And the beetles run across it and they catch their little legs in it. You will catch a couple of bees, but more often than not, you will catch more beetles than anything else with your little dryer sheet, non-scented, preferably natural. So they're actually fairly easy to deal with. Sunshine, beetle traps. If you want to treat them like you consider yourself to have an infestation, you can't move your hives, you can use something called Star Guard, and people drench the ground with it. I don't know how effective it is, but it's supposed to prevent pupation of the little hive beetles. Most of the time in this part of Texas, Houston not so much. Houston has a really bad problem with them. Anywhere that constantly is humid, like Hawaii, has a horrible problem with hive beetles. But this part of Texas, it gets dry like it is now, and the ground gets too hard for them to want to be inside of. Good news for us. So not too much of a problem, but dun dun dun, here comes the boogeyman of the hive. We're gonna spend a little bit of time on this because there are so many treatments for them and there are so many problems associated with hive beetles. This is actually a picture of one of my hives. That is a VARROA mite sitting on a larva, in this case a drone larva, which is the larva they prefer. Now, we covered pests, and VARROA mites got a little bit more spotlight, as they will in this one, in the very first class. So I won't get into it too much about their life cycle, but the VARROA mite is a nasty little booger. It reproduces about 3 times faster than a bee. It reproduces inside a bee cell, and while it is in there, it feeds on the young bee, creating it weak. it's like a baby inside of its mother's womb that has a parasite feeding on it. It's not going to develop as well. The most often symptom of that in bees is crippled wing virus and other viruses, because it also weakens their immune system. And when that bee hatches out, it can have 3 to 4 mites that hatch out with it. And some of those mites hitch a ride on other bees, and at least one of them, maybe 2 of them, hitch a ride on the young bee that just emerged. So that bee is already coming into life handicapped because it has parasites riding on it. And if you're a human, the size of that parasite, if you had a little varroa mite on you, would perhaps be the size of a grapefruit attached to your belly. So it is a large ectoparasite for any bee, any insect of that size. They're little boogers. Some of the symptoms that you can see, people are like, well, I don't see mites. You're not going to see mites. Most of the time, you will see their symptoms, or you will test for mites to see them. You can see in the bottom 2 frames, you can see one bee with a little wing sticking out on the right side. That's called K-wing virus. It's where the wing can no longer fold back in the correct manner. And the little hemuli, the little hooks on the side of it, usually aren't working either. So that bee is handicapped in flight and forever after because of the varroa mite feeding on it as a young bee. And crippled wing virus, which is horrible and will immediately break down your ability to have a strong hive. These are more than symptomatic pests. These are real pests. They're called Varroa destructor, is their actual name, and they can kill a hive very easily. You can do natural methods, such as powder sugar, using drone comb. Drone comb is just a comb that has drone-sized cells on it. They build it out, they fill it with drone comb, and then you actually take them out and freeze it. You put it back in, allow them to clean it out. And the idea is that it lessens the mites that were all in that drone comb because they tend to prefer it. You can powder sugar method. Only works if you have a screen bottom board, but you have that open screen bottom board. You sprinkle powder sugar over them twice to at least a minimum of once a week. It causes the bees to groom, and hopefully they'll groom off their little varroa mite that's usually attached to the underside of their plates. So those are some of the natural methods you can use. There are also some ideas about essential oils and other methods that might prevent the spread of varroa mites. Get a lot of mixed reviews on that. So if you're looking for an all-natural method, you should also plan to compensate by having a couple of extra hives in your bee yard, such as small splits where you can start again, because they will and can knock out an entire hive in very short order. Usually by the time you start seeing K-wing virus and crippled wing virus, 2 pictures at the bottom, your hive is already on a steep decline and may not make it. You want to stop it before that happens. So as soon as you pull off your honey supers, because you don't want to treat with your honey supers, you treat usually for bees if you are not doing the all-natural method. If you're doing an all-natural method, you have to continue that treatment throughout the entirety of your hive's life. Essentially, it doesn't ever stop. In the winter, it slows down, but it doesn't ever stop. So you have to be very attentive to them at all times. They don't seem to be temperature sensitive, although they like warmer climates because the bees tend to produce eggs year-round in warmer climates. So they have a place to live. A couple of treatments. This is just a few. Apistan, Apiguard, Checkmite, Apilife, Quickmite. There's also formic acid and oxalic acid. All of these things can be used to treat your bees. Most of them are the same. They're like a strip or a patty that you put out that the bees either walk across or eat, and it helps kill the mite on them. Anytime you use a chemical treatment, it's going to be a little rough on your bees because you're trying to kill a small bug on top of a bigger bug, and trying to find the right treatment for that means that it's usually going to be hard on the bees. Right now, something to consider is if you're treating in Texas, is some of these are fumigants. There's also HopGuard and Apiguard, which are not pictured on this slide, but they're in little green packages, and that would be the Apiguard. They come in a little tin. Some of them are fumigants, so you can't actually put them out this time of year in Texas because it's so warm that that fumigant will release too quickly and can drive out your bees or stress your bees unduly. It's too high a dosage for your treatment. So you would go with perhaps the Apivar, which is a slow release strip that the bees actually have to walk across. It only takes one treatment, and that's because the bees are walking across it for about 42 days. Other treatments often take more than one treatment because it's only effective for 1 to 2 weeks. That, as a beekeeper, is something that you have to look at. The last option when it comes to that is don't treat at all. What hives make it, but you can expect a 70% loss of your hives every year. As a hobbyist, that's for you to consider. If you have only 7 hives, you're going to end up with 1 by the end of the year on average. Not necessarily, but on average. As a young beekeeper, I had no money to go get these fancy treatments with. So I went the all natural method. I didn't have drone comb. I did the powder sugar, and then I split. Splitting is also one of the things that slows down the varroa mite growth. But I did lose some hives to it. However, I made extra hives every year to compensate for that. And so I kept it steady. If you're someone who keeps an eye on your hives and does really steady maintenance on them, you can overcome it without ever using treatment. But it's not recommended, especially for a first-time beekeeper, because you can easily lose a lot of them. There are a lot of other sicknesses that are related to varroa mite that are caused by their weakening immune system. So you want to keep those in mind. As a beekeeper, it's really important that you do treat appropriately. Now, this was the biggest one. You will always see hive beetles. You almost always see wax moths year to year. Sometimes the years are worse than others. Mites are almost constant. They will bombard your bees. You always should be considering them in your bee plan, period. But now we move on to some of the more nebulous ideas. So we've talked about pests. Those were all pests in the first part. These are diseases. There are diseases that affect bees, lots of them that can kill off hives. The first one is European foul brood. European foul brood is very common. It's also not impossible to treat. The best way to treat is by actually re-queening your hive, because usually in order for them to get sick, the queen has to have a susceptibility to it. This is the top picture on the left is what European foul brood looks like. You can see the dead bees in the bottom of the cell. You can see the mix-match brood pattern. You can see the discoloring of your brood. Anytime you see discoloring of your brood, you should be concerned, not just for foul brood, but for other reasons as well. If you're seeing discolored, spotty brood patterns, it can often be European foul brood. Not too severe. They'll usually overcome it, and you just have to put in some fresh brood. Don't share those frames from hive to hive. And as a beekeeper, this is where hygiene comes in. We don't think about that a lot because bees like to keep their areas sterile and clean. But as a beekeeper, you're moving from hive to hive with the same hive tool. If you're seeing disease in one hive, you need to make sure to sterilize your tool by putting it inside your smoker and allowing that, puffing it, and allowing it to burn off. Or even having a spare pair of gloves to switch gloves between hives. I have done this. I move hives from one bee yard to the other a lot. And I also go into other people's hives. So I always try to be considerate of the fact that I don't want to be bringing a sickness into someone else's hives or bringing one back to my own hives. So if you're going into other people's hives, practice some hygiene. Have 2 pairs of gloves. Have a hive tool. All right, American foul brood. People might be going, American foul brood? People don't talk about it a lot anymore. It is considered eradicated, but you should always know what you're looking at. Don't freak out. American foul brood is very deadly. It is a spore-based sickness. It can live for up to 50 years inside a hive. So when you're getting new equipment or pre-used equipment, you might consider scorching the inside of your hives to help prevent any kind of spread. Now, it has not been seen here in America for quite some time. They eradicated it, as far as we know. But you should always be aware of it and be mindful. So if you're seeing symptoms like this, like European foul brood inside your hive, with your little dying cells and things like that, your sunken caps. And American foul brood, you usually get a smell too, like, oh, what's that smell? You might take a matchstick or a piece of grass and stir inside one of those little cells, and you lift it out, like the bottom picture is showing. If it's stringy, that's considered American foul brood, and you should report it to the Bee Apiary Service of Texas and ask them to come look at your hive, and they can run tests. If that's the case, which has not happened for many years, and I do not expect it to, so don't freak out, burning is considered the only option. You don't save the bees, you chuck it all in a fire and you burn everything. Like I said, it has not been done. More often than not, it is just European foul brood or nothing at all. One of the reasons I address this between summer and fall is because one of the most common times you see European foul brood is from the summer through the fall. That's when it seems to become more prevalent because your queen is aging a little bit and whatever her flaws are start showing. Tracheal mites, something else that you're like, what, another sickness? I guess this should have been in the pest section. Sorry about that. Tracheal mites are still around, but you can't see them, you can't identify them, and there's not a treatment for them. Except a couple of older methods that say like using peppermint or wintergreen inside of a Crisco sugar patty in the hive is supposed to clear that up. It's like having bees that have been smokers for 50 years to have tracheal mites inside your hive. You usually can't identify it unless you have a microscope. The picture on the right demonstrates what a tracheal mite looks like under a microscope, but most people don't have the skill or knowledge, believe me. I've tried, I don't have the skill or knowledge to know how to find them inside your own bees. But this is a bit of the life cycle. They actually go mite to mite, from bee to bee, and they live inside of their breathing airways. You don't want that. You don't want a 50-year-old smoking bee working your hives, but it does happen. There's not a lot of treatments. You can't really identify it. It's just something that exists. There are a lot of sicknesses like that where you're like, we can't treat it. It's there, but you should know about it. As a side note, it's a little less terrifying because it just causes a little bit of a downturn, but not every bee is a 50-year-old smoker, so you don't have to worry about it. Chalk brood, most often seen if you have water sitting on the bottom board of your hive. So screen bottom board is not usually a problem. Really, really wet years where you can have flooding that has water constantly sitting under your hive, or has water inside your hive at any point, or you live in a cool, damp climate like up north more, you might see chalk brood, and it just looks like a little mummy stuck inside of the cell. You also see a spotty brood pattern because the bees are trying to clean them out. If you look on the left lower hand quarter, you can see the little chalk brood right there. That's what it looks like when they pull it outside the hive. But it's easy to treat with your household item, banana. So people are like, banana? I don't really know what is inside the banana. I'm just thinking about doing some research on it. What is in the banana that causes it to be an effective treatment for chalk brood? If you see chalk brood inside your hives, A, make sure they're not sitting over something wet. It is a spore, or actually, excuse me, it is a fungus-based illness, and there are more of them like that, like mummies and just sac brood, other broods like that. Sac brood, chalk brood, those are usually spore-based and they like it wet and cold. Bananas, just an open banana with just the peel on it or peel off it, you slice it in half, you lay it on your hive, it treats it, it clears it up. You might apply bananas more than once, but something about them eating it, it goes away, combined with not having a wet bottom board. Fall, okay, we're done with pests. There's so much in there, but fall and winter will be short. Oop. Yes, fall. So they start working different plants. There's usually a little bit of a reboot. In the fall, you can expect a small honey flow here in Texas. Usually get a little more rain, things produce a little bit of nectar, goldenrod, broomweed, bitterweed, all sorts of plants actually bloom and allow the bees to collect a little bit of surplus. You want to add to that by feeding and hopefully they already have food stores, but if they fill up a couple of supers, or even like if you have a double deep box, you want to see frames of honey throughout your deep box, so deep boxes, plural, so you know that they're going to have honey for the winter. In a single-story hive with a super or a medium on it, you want to see at least a full, and I do mean full, super of honey on top of your hive. If you're not seeing that, you need to be feeding them. You want them to have that at minimum to go through the winter, but if you can stack on a little more, that's nice too, because they usually eat through it come January. It's not usually an issue of having old honey get into your hive or get into your honey flow for the next year. So make sure your bees have enough, because this is the time you prepare for winter. Help your bees. Now they should have some pollen, but this time of year you start seeing like 2 or 3 frames of actual like pollen everywhere on your hives. And you can help substitute that by feeding them a pollen patty. When they eat it, they don't have to eat the pollen that's incoming. They can store it for the winter time. They need both pollen and sugar water because that is their carbohydrate and their protein. So the honey acts as a carbohydrate. It's a sugar, breaks down in their system like that. And then the pollen patty acts as their protein. If they don't have enough protein, you won't see eggs. They start cannibalizing the youngest brood. So always make sure they have protein. And put in your honey stores for winter. You want to make sure that they have everything that they need. That's a really good looking frame. That's kind of what you want to see coming to the fall. Winter, almost done. Winter is really easy. You might put in your entrance reducers. You probably will put in your screen bottom board. You want to make sure that your entrance reducer is not in before it gets cold. The bees control the temperature in the hive. The entrance reducer is to prevent robbing and is not always used. I am not always using them for sure. They're handy, they're nice, and I have them for my weaker hives, but I actually don't put them on my very strongest hives usually because a lot of times I have that Boardman feeder in there and you can't put both in unless you cut it down. You want to be checking your queen's laying pattern. This is really important. Come like late fall, usually it's already in winter. Late fall, usually already in winter, you'll actually see a change in the laying pattern. And this means that the food levels have gone down, the bee levels have gone down, that they usually slow down what they're feeding the bees. First time I saw this, it was about 3 years in. I didn't see it in the first 2 years. Like they were strong. They don't do this every year. But I went into one hive and went, I don't see enough eggs. I see a spotty brood pattern. What's going on? I've lost a queen. I go into the next hive. I'm like, oh no, this one too. I've lost a queen. It looks odd. And then I go to the third one. I'm like, I can't have lost a queen in 3 of them. I go through all my hives and almost as a group, they seem to have gone down in brood production, which is really sad. But if they have enough food, if they have enough stores, if the weather's conducive to it, they don't always do it. But some years, especially drought years or really hard years, they'll often cut down their brood production, and it's almost across the board unanimous. So be concerned about varroa mites, but sometimes late winter, fall, you might just see a weird little drop off, and the bees usually duck down. They don't produce very well for a while, and then they come back up and they make themselves a much smaller brood pattern. They're still there, they're still queen laying eggs, but it went spotty for a little while. Just something you should always be aware of. Build equipment. This is the time of year when you should have ordered your queens and build your equipment. You're prepping for spring already. Plus, there's more indoor activities to do, and you can actually make the time to build your equipment. Don't forget your bees. Give them the gift of getting into them. Okay, so most of the time, my honey stores last through Christmas. I don't have to check them too much, but I do. I check them usually at least once a week. I think this last year, I didn't check them all of 2 weeks out of the year, and that was because of foul weather, and it was January. You in Texas oftentimes can get into them almost year round. 50 degrees is in Fahrenheit, 50 degrees Fahrenheit, you can get into your bees pretty comfortably. Even though to us, Texans, we're like, it's cold. We don't want to chill the bees. They can handle it. If you're running low on food, if they don't have enough pollen, it's more important that they actually have those stores than you being in them for the briefest moment to check on them and out again. You just don't take as long in the hive. Like I said, I was in my bees. I checked them very quickly. I did not stay in them. But we don't usually have snow mounded up on our beehives. We don't have to deal with any of that. My recommendation, keep an eye on them. And one of the tricks as a beekeeper that you should be aware of that bees like to play on you is you pop that top box and it's covered with bees. They're doing really well. Don't take that for granted. Look down 3 boxes or 2 boxes, however many boxes you have on there. The bees like to eat their way all the way up to the top, and they all sit up there looking like, there's just so many of us. There's just so many of us. Don't trust them. They might be completely out of the bottom. You could have them all in that one super on like 4 frames, and there's nothing down below. And that's a problem. It means that you're weak. You want them to grow a little bit. Time of year, it's not totally unusual. Your brood levels do go down. Your hive will get smaller. And when I need to repair equipment, that's what I do with it. I put it on the bottom of my hive during the winter because it may have brood in it, it may have honey in it, but it's scrubby equipment. It needs to be refurbished. I need to pull the combs. I put it at the bottom and I allow boxes at the top. They fill those boxes with honey, and as the winter goes on, they start eating up through them. They're at the top. There are no bees, no products in that bottom box, and I can just pull it off and go take it and repair it, which is one of the reasons it's prime season for taking care of your equipment. And bees are amazing. Okay, one of my advice to beekeepers who are just starting out, beekeeping is so much fun. It really is amazing. I have done it for years and years, and I'm still awed by them. But one of the things you have to do is you have to keep it alive. Don't allow guilt to stop you from participating. Sometimes we're like, I haven't been in my hive in 3 weeks. Oh, I haven't been in my hive in 4 weeks. I feel guilty. I shouldn't go in. Don't let that stop you. Whenever you start drying out, because you will, at about 2 to 3 years, I want you to go ahead and take a conference, take a class. Keep that love of beekeeping alive, because it is really easy to keep it alive, to be amazed by such a cool insect. Just do something new, shake it up, go to a conference, take a class, and try something new with your hives. Maybe try a flow hive or a top bar hive. Just keep it interesting. All right, so that's all for me. I'm going to look at your questions now.
So Shannon, Kathy Huffstetler has a question. So Kathy, if you'll unmute.
Okay, is it too late to do a split?
It is not a good time to do a split, but you can do one. I don't necessarily recommend it, because this time of year your drone levels are going down. You have to have a queen accessible usually, like if you have a pre-packaged, pre-mated queen, which are really hard to find this time of year. They just are, because like I said, those drone levels are going down. They're not going to want to mate them because they can't be assured of their mating quality. So you can do a split. I would do a small mini split. If you have a queen to put in it, you can go ahead and make that happen. You have to keep on top of their food. You have to make sure you're not overfeeding them, because if you overfeed them, they'll fill in the areas where that queen needs to lay eggs, and it will further weaken them. But you can do it. Again, not recommended, but possible. I've done it. For me, I've stopped. That's enough for me. I don't have any queens that's accessible, and they aren't at full strength. Sometimes maybe, but generally I'm done with the splits until fall. Usually you can do a couple of fall splits, but the problem is getting them through the winter. Their likelihood of getting through the winter is not as great. I usually have about a 50% success rate fall splits or late summer splits. So that's up to you, but it's like, your choice. It's more risky than a spring split.
Thank you.
Okay, I hope that wasn't too convoluted of an answer.
Joanne Curley's asking,
Okay.
are there opportunities to do beekeeping on other people's land? She lives in McKinney and doesn't really have space for her own hives or hives on her own property. So how does she find out about that?
So she's asking if a beekeeper would be interested in putting bees on her land.
No, she's looking to put bees on other people's land.
All I can say is I turn down offers for that all the time, but I honestly don't keep the numbers. Most of the time I find that through being a part of the club, but we're not meeting right now because I have people who come in and they're like, I'm moving out to 50 acres. I really want a beekeeper. Do you know anyone who wants to put hives out? And that's how people get asked usually. But I don't necessarily have a recommendation for like a chat room or a website you can go to where landowners ask beekeepers to bring out their hives. Most of the time, people just stumble across that. They meet someone and they're like, oh, would you like to put bees on my land? Or they ask them, would you be interested in having bees on my land? It's more often than not a face-to-face. If someone else knows about like a website or a chat window, feel free to chime in. I personally don't.
Yeah, we do occasionally receive inquiries at our main email address for the club, and we will post those then to our Facebook page. And Joanne, I know that you recently joined the Facebook group, so that would be probably the best opportunity right now. We have talked about trying to maintain a registry of people that are interested in placing hives, and when we get those requests, forward that information to those people. So our secretary, Nancy Deshand, is the one trying to maintain that list. So you can send an email to secretary@cchba.org, and she'll add you to the list of people that are interested in placing hives. And then you might get direct notification from her whenever we receive something. Joanne's second question was, how do we go about getting mentored? And we actually have a lapse in that right now. The person that was coordinating our mentor program, his job duties changed, and so he's not as available as he once was. And so our mentor program right now is pretty much on hold. But if you post something to the Facebook group, we have a number of veteran members there that can respond to questions. Or if you need somebody to come visit you, you might be able to put a call out there and someone might be able to respond. So right now it's kind of ad hoc, one-on-one kind of thing. We don't have a structured program. Next question is, how can we get help with beekeeping classes for beginners?
Well, there's a couple of good places that I can recommend. There are undoubtedly more places elsewhere. Of course, we do a Beekeeping 101 class, which is very reasonable. It's like this, only more biology of beekeeping and other things. But there is Texas Bee Supply, which does a short class, like a one-day class, and you can go through a Beekeeping 101 class that's about half a day. And then there's also Sabine Creek Honey Farm, John Talbert's class, and he goes through a more extensive process depending on what you're looking for, and it is 5 months long. You start the class, and it's one weekend a month, usually it's on a Saturday. It'll either be morning or evening, and you get a schedule after you sign up, and they walk you through the biology of beekeeping. It's about a half day at a time, so you get 5 classes. And then they also will help you start your hive. Like you go into the bee yard with them, weather permitting. As you used to with Texas Bee Supply, but because of COVID, they don't have that right now. They probably will get back to that though. I think that they're opening up some people who had questions to come to Texas Bee Supply and go through their bee yard with an expert. But depending on what you're looking for, if you're looking for the short and sweet class, you might go to Texas Bee Supply. If you're looking for something more extensive where you have tutoring throughout quite a large span of the year, about 5 months, then you would go to John Talbert's class at Sabine Creek Hunting Farms. I know that there are other places, those are the two where I know the people, I can recommend that they're going to teach you well and that they're going to do a great job.
Yeah, and COVID has really put a damper on most of the conferences and classes that might have been available otherwise. But Sabine Creek Honey's class normally starts in January, and we typically promote it for him since he is a long-standing member of our club. And so you'll be able to find out from our communications if he's going to be able to host it in the spring. The next question is talking about treating. You mentioned that it was too hot for Apigard, but our presenter at the last meeting said since it was going to be cooler this week, it was a good time to do that. What is the risk if we've already done it, and what should we watch for? And if I might answer part of that, we use Apigard, and if you read the label, it's actually good to 105 degrees. We treated a half dose on the anticipation that it was going to get hotter after this current cool spell, if 95 is cool. So again, it's good, or it's labeled for up to 105 degrees. So it's actually okay to use Apigard in this time frame. Now, as far as if you use the full dose per the package, what should you watch out for? Shannon, if you want to respond to that part.
Usually it's that your bees are driven away from the section. Like you might have a dead out of brood, or they might not be going to the top boxes at all because the fumes rise up. So it's usually that they kind of compact down, and or you'd have to put a very strong dose on for it to be too strong. But I didn't remember it being 105. I remember it being 95. I actually put it in smaller doses for a longer period when I used it, because it used to be one of the only products around that I could get my hands on. So you can use it in smaller doses throughout a longer period and you'll still be pretty effective. But most of the time, if he says it's rated for 105, then maybe the new stuff is. Maybe I'm thinking of the older stuff.
Yeah, I mean, this was a new package that we had just opened. So the label says 105. All right, so I think that's all the questions, okay. Shannon.
All right, well, I hope I didn't sound too scattered and that everybody had a great time. I'm really glad to be here, and have a wonderful rest of the month.